Welcome to this talk on Highland amphibians and reptiles of Namibia. So this talk is a bit of an outflow from three publications on the reptiles and amphibians of the Highlands of Namibia and of Angola. So I've listed the co-authors for these publications at the bottom in no particular order. I'm going to do a bit of a review of some of the special Highland endemics that we find in this area. And then we're going to look at some of the recent research that has been done and some of the gaps that need filling that we're currently working on. Right, so the highlands in question are found in sub-Saharan Africa, southwestern Africa to be exact. So the two countries, Namibia and Angola, are outlined in white. And in yellow, you can see the highland areas that we're talking about. So it's mostly the western escarpment of the subcontinent and a few inland plateau areas or mountain ranges. Now, this area has been highlighted as or identified as a key biodiversity area, both for species diversity and especially a hotbed for species endemism that is of regional and global importance. The papers were published as part of a monograph on the highlands and escarpments of Angola and Namibia that will also be published as an atlas. So the first paper, we looked at some of the reptile species, the mountain specialist reptile species across this area. We then focused in on one of the genera, the flat geckos or Aphrodura. These are all rapiculus or rock-living geckos that specialize on these montane habitats. And finally, we had a paper on the montane amphibians of this region. They're all frogs, and this is probably my favorite group. So Namibia is the drier of the two countries. It's a lot more arid than Angola. It is the most arid country in sub-Saharan Africa. And some of the desert regions on the west and the southwest of the country receive less than 5 millimeters of rainfall on average annually. What that actually means is that it doesn't rain for 2 or 3 years, and then it rains a little bit, like 20 or 30 millimeters in some of these places. The Namib Desert itself is fed by fog from the desert, and a lot of the highlands in this desert zone are also dependent, or the biological communities up here are dependent on the fog. So you can see the highland areas highlighted in yellow on this map. You can see that they don't form one big continuous mountain chain. Rather, it's a big collection of inselbergs and a few mountain ranges. Only the central highlands are a big sort of continuous area of highlands. And because of the way that this is structured, the montane specialist species only have basically small patches of habitat on these mountains that are separated by tens or hundreds of kilometers from other mountains. And this really sets the scene for allopatric speciation, whereby populations are separated from each other for millions of years. And that has given rise to a number of sort of small range endemic species and a few species radiations that have occurred across these mountains. The Namibian highlands and much of Namibia actually is quite poorly surveyed, particularly when you compare it to the neighboring South Africa. So there are essentially a number of the species that we're looking at now have only been recently discovered and described. And there's probably quite a few species that are left to discover in this area. One example from the plant side of things, this tree was only officially described and named last year. It was discovered in the northwestern montane regions of Namibia. I mean, this thing grows 8 meters tall, so it's a really large tree species to have been missed for all these years. An example from the lowlands of Namibia, this is Beitel's bullfrog. It's a really large amphibian. In fact, it's the biggest frog discovered in over 100 years. And this one was only officially named this year. I was fortunate enough to be part of the team that went to go collect the type series. You can see they have these beautiful blue and yellow patterns dorsally. Again, you can ask yourself the question, how is it possible that in this day and age, we're still discovering new species of vertebrates and large plants, not just insects and bacteria, the tiny things. Well, of course, the golden age of taxonomy, where explorers were going all over the world and finding new things, describing new species. That happened during the late 1700s until the sort of early 1900s, and then it died down a lot towards the middle and the late 1900s. But in the last 10 or 20 years, it's really picked up again. And one of the big reasons for that is the introduction of molecular sequencing or DNA sequencing, which is now much cheaper, and a lot of biologists are able to do this. In the olden days, essentially the only way that you could tell the difference between species was to look at preserved museum specimens and look at the morphological features on these preserved specimens. Of course, a lot of the features don't preserve well, and the morphological features that you pick to decide like what's one species, what's a different species, they're actually kind of arbitrary and not always tied to the evolutionary history of the species. But if you look at the genes, that is the actual thing that's being passed on from one generation to the next. And so that gives us insight into the evolutionary history. And we're able to tell whether two populations have been separated or whether they've been cross-mating and for how long they've been separated. And so this has really given us a huge insight into the speciation process and has allowed us to discover quite a few new species. There are also new species that are being found simply because some of these areas are very remote and hardly anyone has surveyed there. And species discovery has really picked up, particularly for reptiles and amphibians over the last 10 or 20 years. I think over the last 10 years, there's been around 100 or over 100 new reptile species described globally each year. And there's been actually over 150 new amphibian species described each year. So we're sort of entering into a second, or we are already in a second golden age of taxonomy, if you could see it that way. All right, so on to Namibia, and I'm going to start with the amphibians, particularly because this is a very short list. On our paper on the Highland amphibians, we only listed one mountain specialist or strict mountain endemic amphibian from Namibia, and it occurs in the central highlands as marked by that red star. The species is Hirsch's pygmy toad or Pontinophrynus hirschi. The species is, well, it's quite pretty, I think. There are a couple of different color patterns, and you can't see from these pictures, but it's actually a really, really small frog. So here's a fully grown adult held between my thumb and forefinger, and I'll admit I have rather dainty fingers. So it really is quite a small frog. This species was previously thought to occur in a huge area across much of central Namibia, but due to recent DNA sequences that we were able to obtain and also call recordings, we're able to basically confirm that the specimens from the north are actually a different species, Pontinophrynus damaranus. The ones from the northwest are another different species that looks kind of similar, Pontinophrynus dombensis. And then we recently resurrected another species from the south, which is Pontinophrynus jordani. It was actually described in 1936, but because it looks kind of similar, they Poynton, I think, lumped them in the late 1900s. And I must say, with the frog work, it's not only the genetics, we're really using an integrated approach to assess the species, and the recording of their advertisement calls or the mating calls is a key sort of central aspect of that. So the males are the ones that call, and they do so to attract females, and the females can recognize the call of their own species. So differences in call, or well, substantial differences in call in amphibians are pretty much always an indicator of different species. So this one wasn't listed as a strict mountain endemic. We collected it from the lowlands next to these Naukluft mountains, but actually it seems like they probably do live in the mountains, but they come down to breed in these tiny rock pools that only appear for a few days or a few weeks after a big rainfall event. So in reality, we probably have two montane specialist pygmy toad species in Namibia. Then the one that occurs on the northwestern escarpment mostly occurs on mountains, but we haven't listed it as a strict endemic because you also find it in the lowlands. And then quite recently, a colleague of mine collected a little toad from up here. I can't give away too many details or say exactly where it was, because we're pretty sure that it is a new species. And so all I can say for now is that Namibia definitely has more than one mountain endemic Pointinophrina species, but there's still much work to be done. All right, another species that I'd like to cover is Phrynomanthes annectens, or the marbled rubber frog. So this is quite a beautiful little species, also smaller than you might expect. And this one occurs throughout these highlands, throughout the entire Namibia, also slightly across into South Africa and into southern Angola. Now, this species, it's another thing that occurs in the lowlands in places. It seems to be a specialist on the rocky habitats. So that's why it usually occurs in the mountains, but you also find it lower down in some places. And this is a good candidate for a species complex. The reason being that, well, it is quite small, so it doesn't move around very much. And they appear to occur, they don't occur all over the place. They occur in these tiny populations tied to mountain springs or particular rock pools way up on the mountain. And so there's a good chance that these populations occurring across the range have been separated from each other for long periods of time. Another reason why I think there might be a complex is that in the rest of the species, color pattern is indicative of species. So when you have different color patterns, that's almost certainly an indicator that you have different species. And if you just look at the faded museum specimens, you can't really see that. But if you pull some photos off of iNaturalist from different parts of their range, you can see that there's a substantial variation in their color patterns when you go to different areas. And so this is a group that we're busy collecting to look at their calls, their DNA, and the specimens to basically sort out. But we're almost certain that this one is a species complex and not a single species across the whole range. All right, I'm moving on to the reptiles. Now, there's a long list of mountain specialist reptiles in the southwestern African highlands. So we're not going to go through even half of them. I'm just going to focus on a couple of specials, so basically small range endemics that you only find on a particular mountain or mountain range or in a small part of these highlands. And so these red stars mark the locations of some of these special species that we'll be looking at. So we'll start right in the top left-hand corner at the northwestern edge of Namibia. So here, marked in red, is the Otjihipa Mountain. It's part of a much larger mountain range. It's at the northern border of Namibia, right just south of the Orange River. You certainly can't drive there. It's an extremely rugged landscape. If you really know your way around a 4x4, the closest place you can drive is the Marinfluss, which is that sandy desert valley you can see on the bottom left. And if you manage to drive there, then it's a 22-kilometer walk across extremely rugged, hot and dry mountainous terrain to get to the Otjihipa Mountains. If you look at this image, that gives you an idea of the kind of journey that you need to make it there. So because of its remoteness, very few scientists have surveyed these mountains, particularly the Otjihipa Mountain. There have been a couple actually, and it's just a very poorly known area. We had a little bit more funding, so we didn't have to walk up there. The Namibian University of Science and Technology had a big project in collaboration with a couple of Angolan institutions. And so we flew up to a few mountaintops in southern Angola and also the Otjihipa Mountains in northern Namibia with a helicopter. So here is the team that was present, although the Angolans didn't join us actually on the first flight up to the Otjihipa Mountains. The two somewhat elderly gentlemen, second and third from the right over there, actually went up to the Otjihipas on foot when they were a bit younger and nearly died of thirst. We flew up to the mountain, they dropped us off among the rocks, and we set up our camp, being quite confident that we'd be the only humans for many kilometers around, but that was not so. About 20 minutes later, an Ovahimba herdsman with some of his goats arrived to come and check out the scene. And so the Ovahimbas, this is their this is their cultural homeland, and many of them still stick to their cultural nomadic small herding lifestyle. Travel long distances with their flock. They really know the veld or the bush well. They know where the water points are. And I know these guys can go for well over a day, trekking over really tough mountainous terrain without drinking water. I've never seen a Himba herdsman carrying a water bottle. So they certainly know and are able to live in this landscape. It's quite amazing that we don't only find, poorly known plant and animal species up in this landscape, but that there are people also making a living here. The mountain top is quite beautiful. It contains many endemic plant species that are already recorded from this area, including these tall cactus-like Euphorbiaceae that give it a sort of alien feel. We found a couple of cool caves up there, and these Namibian rock agamas frequented the caves. This is a very strange color form for the species, and this is something that we'll certainly be looking at or investigating further using phylogenetics. The one botanist vessel took us to this patch of sandstone rock. So most of these mountains are calcstone or dolomite, but there's one particular mountain slope sort of in the middle on top that has sandstone on it. And he'd previously collected a cordylid lizard here. So we went up to find this little guy. It's a girdled lizard that was previously only known from Angola. So that'll be a new country record. We're quite glad we found it, but we also found this beautiful gecko up in these sandstones that turned out to be a new species. And in 2022, we named it Aphrodira ochihipa after the mountain. So it's the Ochihipa flat gecko. The species is only known from this location. We were only up there for pretty much one full day, and we collected one male and one female specimen. So it's only known from those two. The male actually has a beautifully banded black and white tail that it probably uses to signal the female. But when I captured it, the tail broke off and fell into a really deep rock crevice. So you're just going to have to believe me. Okay. Up next, we're looking at species that we didn't actually list in our reptile paper. So it occurs over there close to Ruacana. It's known as the Kunene racer. So this is a very rare and poorly understood species. I think there's only a total of 6 recorded sightings, including the type specimens that were collected for the species. There were recently 2 people that recorded them, and one of them was from the top of the Zebra Mountains. So most of the records are from the lowlands surrounding these mountains, but it's mainly because sometimes us herpetologists are a bit lazy to climb up to gigantic mountains in scorching heat. So it's possible that the mountains are actually an important core habitat for the species. We just don't know. Up next, I'd like to take you down the escarpment onto the Brandberg Massif, the little star in the south, and the Etendeka Formation further north. The Brandberg Massif is a huge pile of granite and intrusive formation. You can't really see the scale of it on this image. Here's an oblique satellite image of the Massif. So it's about 2,000 meters high and over 30 kilometers wide. It's a pretty big pile of rock. And there are a couple of insect and plant species that are known to be endemic to the top of this mountain, but not so much for the reptiles and amphibians, partially because of the lack of surveys up on the top. But we do have Pachydaculus guyaiensis, which is known only from the Brandberg and a few surrounding mountain patches. There's also the closely related Pachydaculus, is a sister species to this one, and you find it on the Etendeka Mountains and a few mountain tops to the southern tip of Angola. This is quite a beautiful species that has these really long gracile limbs, and it walks slowly, kind of like a chameleon. It looks a bit like a nocturnal chameleon with these huge eyes as well. Here's just a pretty picture of the Etendeka Formation and the sort of purple rocks that you find in this area. The Aphrodira africana, the African flat gecko, is also known from this area. But I put it in inverted commas because this is another thing that needs sorting out. We already know from phylogenetic evidence that certainly in the Erongo Mountains, a little bit further east, there are there are 2 species that occur together on the mountain. And this species it needs a lot more collecting and studying from basically all down the escarpment. Rhoptropus diporus is another species that you only find in this area on a few mountaintops. Right, next we're looking at the Otavi Mountains, so that's northern central Namibia. This area has only 2 reptile species known to be endemic to these mountains, Pachydaculus boomii and otaviensis. So these are, once again, only known from a few specimens, the type series, and then 1 or 2 people have seen them since. So they're known from very few records in these Otavi Mountains. This is not an Otavi Mountain endemic. This is actually an East African species, the black file snake. But there is a strange disjunct population in the Otavi Mountains and also in the Khomas Mountains that's separated from the rest of the range by probably a few hundred kilometers. Then we have the Waterberg Mountain, the Waterberg Plateau. So this is a big sandstone set of cliffs with a flat top. It sort of slopes down to the eastern side, and you find this in the middle of the Kalahari sand. I couldn't find great pictures for this online. They don't quite do it justice. But you have these sheer cliffs around much of the mountain, and these are used as a strategic sort of natural game fence. And there's a national park up on the top of the mountain where we keep black rhinos and other game that's sensitive to poachers. You have 2 lizard species that are known to be endemic to the Waterberg. One is the Waterberg thick-tailed gecko. And so this one's juvenile has quite a pretty and distinct color pattern. And then you have the reddish sand lizard. I don't know why we call this genus sand lizards. Almost all of them occur on rocks. But anyway, there you have it. And now we move south to the Central Highlands, or the Khomas Highlands. So these, like I said, it's quite a big continuous stretch of mountains, but it contains a number of different rock types and geologies. If you zoom in a bit closer, and you also have slightly different biological communities occurring across these. There's a large number of montane specialist reptile species up here, so we're only going to look at a few of them. So this is the Jordan's girdled lizard. It's got a pretty cool dragon-like appearance, and this one is quite rare, but it's even more rarely seen because they're very shy and they have good eyesight. So they see you coming from a long way away, and then they hide away deep into a rock crack. They actually kind of lock their jaw and jam themselves into the crack, and then they use that big spiky tail to wrap around themselves as a protective mechanism. We also have the much smaller Herero Nama lizard, which is an interesting common name, since the Hereros and Namas waged war in the area where you find these lizards. Historically, but it's actually just Nama lizard is according to the genus. Other species were described first, and then this is the Herero girdled lizard. You also find it south of the Khomas Highlands in a few patches. Then we have a couple of Pachydaculus species that are endemic to the Central Highlands. Pachydaculus reconditus, which is quite common around the Windhoek area. And then Cobotsensis, which has beautiful patterning, and this one is more common in the southern edge of the Central Highlands. So this genus Pachydaculus is extremely diverse in Namibia. It probably makes up around a quarter of Namibian reptile species. So they've really had an extensive radiation on across the mountains of Namibia. I'm only listing a couple of the species here, but there are a large number of them that are montane specialists, or some of them that live on the lowlands but are specific to certain rock types. I'm also giving a picture here of the festive gecko, not because it's a small range endemic. You find it across much of the central and southern highlands in Namibia. But it is quite an interesting species because it has no close relatives on the subcontinent or anywhere. it seems to be a survivor from the age of the dinosaurs, if you date the phylogeny. And then we also have this little thread snake. It's really tiny, and it's also another East African snake, which has a disjunct population in the Khomas Highlands. I'm not too confident that this is actually Leptotyphlos incognitus, or the incognito thread snake. We haven't looked at it from a genetics perspective. And these little thread snakes don't have a lot of features to look at if you're a taxonomist. I mean, it's a little wormy thing. It has a couple of scales on the head that you can kind of quantify and measure. But this is a group that has turned up a lot of new species after genetic investigations. And there's been hardly any of that work on the Namibian thread snakes. All right, now moving further south, there's a whole bunch of mountains, sort of isolated mountains and mountain ranges along the southwestern escarpment. So these are really at the edge of and in the Namib Desert. I'm quite fond of these landscapes just because of the contrast between the sandy plains and the mountains, or the gravel plains and the mountains. And some of these are really quite substantial in their height, well over 1,000 meters. And they're also quite poorly surveyed, but we already know of a few endemic species that you only find in these mountains. And so here is one that was described, I think, a couple of years ago, the Sossus gecko. Its juvenile also has a very distinctive color pattern on the top right. It was named Et Ultra, which means and beyond, after I think it's an NGO that's quite active in the area, called And Beyond. The Campbell's Nama lizard is another interesting one that's very rarely collected. It's another really shy beast, and it's only found on a couple of mountain tops in the southwestern escarpment. It also has that characteristic spiky tail shared by the other girdled lizards. And then the grasshopper thread snake is another one that you find in this region. It gets a bit bigger than that. That's not my hand palm, but you can see that it's a really tiny snake. And that's another candidate for, another priority species to look at the genetics of different populations to see if it's really all one thing. Finally, we have a really special tortoise species that you find in the Aus Mountains and just a few granite mountains down the southern escarpment. So this is the smallest or second smallest tortoise species in the world. There's some argument with the South Africans about this, depending on how many specimens you measure. But it's really tiny. It fits in the palm of your hand. And you can see it's got this characteristic flat shell that allows it to jam itself into rocky crevices, or it also crawls under these huge boulders. So it's quite a strange habit for a tortoise. It climbs rather well, and it's very rarely spotted. It seems to spend a lot of the year hiding in these rocky crevices or under boulders, and then it emerges during thunderstorms. So it's also known as the thunderstorm tortoise for that reason. It's probably the only tortoise in the world that's known to fog harvest. So it actually, when the fog rolls in, these tortoises actually sort of elevate the back of their shell by lifting their back legs, and then the water condenses on the shell and kind of runs forward, and they drink the water that runs off the shell. So it's quite a cool little species. Then we're moving to the Great Karas Mountains in the southeast of Namibia. So this is another very poorly surveyed patch of mountains. It's next to a main road, but it is actually quite remote. Didn't manage to find any good images of this online, but it's also a substantial mountain range. There have been quite a few mountain specialist reptile species recorded from there. I don't think there's any mountain specialist amphibian species recorded from there, but like I said, it's quite poorly surveyed. And then we do know about one gecko species that's only found on the Karasberg itself. Finally, we have the Hans Orange mountain complex in the far south. And so this mountain chain starts in Namibia and then carries on south of the Orange River into the Northern Cape and the Western Cape of South Africa. Now, the South African side of these mountains are quite well surveyed, and so many of the small range endemics that we know from these mountains are actually ones that were described from and recorded from South Africa, but are also found on the Namibian side. But the Namibian side needs a lot more survey effort. There are probably a few South African species that occur across that boundary, and perhaps a few things that only occur on the Namibian side. We just don't know. Here are some of the beautiful species that you find up there. This is Attenborough's flat lizard. The males have these lovely blue and orange colors that they use to impress the females. Here's a desert mountain adder that only occurs on these mountains, along the Orange River, and a few mountains, and the sort of southwest escarpment. And then, of course, there are a couple of Pachydaculus species and other geckos that are only known from these mountains. In conclusion, these arid mountains in Namibia host an amazing array of species and biological assemblages. The mountains are quite harsh, and the conditions are difficult to work in. And because of that, there's still quite a lot of work to do and new creatures to discover in these lonely landscapes. Thank you very much.